Street photography is a subgenre of documentary photography that is important for telling the story of human day-to-day life in cities and urban areas around the world. Also called candid photography, street photography is the practice of capturing candid pictures of everyday life in the street. We usually define the street as any public place where a photographer can take pictures of subjects unknown to her and unconscious whenever possible of her presence. Street photography is characterized by instantaneity, capturing a particular moment or action as it happens that instant, multiplicity, the ability of the photographer to create a series of pictures, and anonymity, the ability of the photographer to stay largely behind the scenes and unknown to their subject matter. Street photographers look for the quirkiness of life on the street and try to capture the unique personality of a particular place embodied in that life. To understand modern and contemporary Western street photography, we need to look at the importance of two major cities, Paris and New York. Before World War II, Paris represented the cultural capital of Old Europe, and New York that of a New World. Paris, in a way, gave birth to street photography, because out of Paris in the 18th and 19th centuries came the metaphor of the street as theater. In the mid-1800s, French writers like Gustave Flaubert and Victor Hugo noted how much of the drama of life played out in the streets of the city. To these artists, the boulevard was a symbol of modern Paris. City life was public life, and the street was the stage of urban drama where all the cultural vitality and variety of the city itself played out. The term flaneur, which means a walker or stroller, became a popular term to describe a certain type of Parisian, one who walked the streets and frequented the cafes, seeing and being seen. The flaneur was a cultural observer, and to many writers and artists of the time, a symbol of modern urban experience. Photography brought these flaneurs the ability to capture and describe this cultural vitality instantaneously in real time, and street photography was born. The first street photography looked quite a bit different than what we think of as being street photography today. Before handheld portable cameras, photographers were limited to view cameras that had to be set up and required a long exposure. So early street photography is often devoid of people. An early pioneer of street photography in Paris was Eugene Atget. Atget was a failed actor who took up photography in the late 1800s, around the time that photography was experiencing a rapid expansion in commercial and amateur fields. In 1897, he started his Old Paris project, documenting a modernizing city before old architecture was destroyed to make way for new construction. Between 1897 and 1927, Atget made pictures showing various facets of the city: narrow lanes and courtyards in the historic city center, shops and window displays, bridges and quays on the Seine, and stairwells and unique architectural details. He also sometimes captured people: tradesmen, street hawkers, prostitutes, and rag collectors. He used a large format view camera that required long exposures, so more often than not he shot at times when the street was largely deserted in the early morning. For Atget, since he couldn't be spontaneous, composition, framing, and point of view were extremely important. He looked for unusual and whimsical detail in addition to typical subjects and spaces. In most of his shots, it's not the subject matter itself that's interesting, but the way he treated it. For example, in his image of the Rue de Mars, he seems to focus on a blank wall, and he directs our eye there, so it takes just a minute to register the two people in the frame, especially the woman in the window, who are surprising and even a little creepy. The way he meticulously framed his shots would influence future generations of street photographers, including Henri Cartier-Bresson and contemporary street photographers who became famous in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. New York at the turn of the 20th century was also a cultural capital of an emerging New World leader. We looked at New York extensively in part one of the documentary lectures in the context of activist social documentary, and indeed most of the photography coming out of New York during this period that wasn't pictorialist or painterly in nature was social documentary. But there were a few photographers interested in the nature and the life of the street just as it was, without needing to use it for purposes of reform. Paul Strand, a student of Louis Hine, who we looked at in that lecture, took pictures intending to capture the movement in New York, movement in the streets, the movement of traffic, the movement of people walking in the parks. His images were both abstract and controlled. Bernice Abbott was an American art student who was an assistant in Paris to the surrealist photographer Man Ray. She'd studied sculpture but had no photography experience before working for Ray. As his assistant, she took immediately to photography and gradually began doing her own work using Ray's studio to develop and process her photos. In the 1920s, her subjects were mostly people in the artistic and literary worlds of Paris between the two world wars. While in Paris, she was introduced to Atget's work and became determined to promote it. After his death in 1927, she was largely responsible for making him a known photographer. In 1929, she traveled to New York to try to find a publisher for Atget's work and rediscover the potential of the city for her own photography, which by that point had become mostly documentary in nature. She relocated permanently later that year and began shooting the streets of New York with the same intensity and attention to detail that she'd admired in Atget's work. This was an ongoing project for years. She was featured in the Changing New York exhibition of 1937. Bernice Abbott's effort to promote Eugene Atget paid off, and both he and she were highly influential to a generation of street photographers working in Paris and New York in the years before World War II. Brassai, a pseudonym for Gulia Halas, was a Hungarian-French photographer, sculptor, writer, filmmaker who flourished in the Parisian art scene between World War I and World War II. He moved to Paris in 1924 after having worked in Berlin as a journalist for Hungarian newspapers. In Paris, he took a job as a journalist and moved in the literary and artistic circles famous in the city at the time. His love for the city led him to photography in order to capture the beauty of streets and gardens in the rain and fog and capture Paris at night. His first book, Paris by Night, was published in 1933. He was called the Eye of Paris and had a one-man exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1948. Robert Doisneau was a French photographer and champion of humanist photography. Heavily influenced by Eugene Atget and Henri Cartier-Bresson, a Hungarian photographer who helped teach Brassai, and a contemporary of Henri Cartier-Bresson, Doisneau was known for modest, playful, and ironic images of mingling social classes and eccentrics in the streets and cafes of Paris, especially children at play. He came from the world of advertising and made a living with ad photography, but he found a fulfilling career in freelance photojournalism, reaching his peak in the 1950s. He wrote, "I don't photograph life as it is, but life as I would like it to be." In 1951, Edward Steichen curated the 5 French Photographers exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, which included these photographers as well as Henri Cartier-Bresson, Isis, and Willy Roni, and highlighted their importance as cultural observers of human life. In New York, despite a preoccupation with the Great Depression and problems associated with it, street photography was carving out a little niche for itself among the blossoming of social documentary photography of the period. Walker Evans, who we looked at in the first documentary lecture, was an American photographer mostly known for his work with the RA and FSA during the 1930s, documenting the rural effects of the Great Depression with a wide-format camera. But once he left the FSA in 1938, he took an interest in a more intimate, anonymous approach to documenting daily life in New York. He started taking pictures in the New York City subway with a camera hidden in his coat. These were published in a 1966 book called Many Are Called. In 1938 and 39, he mentored Helen Levitt, who went on to become a famous street photographer in her own right. Helen Levitt was an American photographer who's been called the most celebrated and least known photographer of her time. After dropping out of high school, she worked for commercial portrait photographer J. Florian Mitchell and learned her way around the darkroom. She saw an exhibition of Cartier-Bresson's work at the Julian Levy Gallery and was fascinated by the idea of photography as art. She purchased a Leica in the mid-1930s because that was the camera favored by Cartier-Bresson. She began her photographic career by taking pictures of children's chalk drawings on the streets of New York City. Those were published in 1987. And she continued making more street photographs in East Harlem, the Garment District, and on the Lower East Side. She pioneered the use of color photography and published her first major collection, A Way of Seeing, in 1965. The common denominator between Paris and New York in the decades just before and just after World War II was Henri Cartier-Bresson. Born in 1908 near Paris to a wealthy family, Cartier-Bresson grew up in a bourgeois neighborhood in Paris. His parents supported him financially so he could freely pursue photography. He started with a Kodak box Brownie and later used a view camera. In the 1920s, he attended Cambridge University after having studied painting at a private art school. In the 20s, he fell in with surrealist photographers, preoccupied with an appetite for both usual and unusual subject matter. After mandatory military service, he spent some time in Africa, then returned to France in 1931 and deepened his relationship with the surrealists. By then, he'd acquired a Leica camera that he would use for many years. He reveled in the anonymity that a small camera allowed him, as opposed to a large, cumbersome view camera. He could now capture the world in its actual state of movement and transformation. He took pictures all over the world and in 1935 came to the U.S. and showed at the Julian Levy Gallery in New York. In World War II, he served in the French Army as a corporal in the film and photography department. He was a German POW, but managed to escape and work for the French resistance. At the end of the war, he made a documentary about returning war refugees for the American Office of War Information. And in 1947, he, along with Robert Capa and David Chim Seymour, started Magnum Photos. In 1952, he published The Decisive Moment, a seminal survey of his work, largely in the West pre-World War II and in the East post-World War II, in which he articulated his theory of what made good, compelling street photography. The literal translation of Images à la sauvette, the book's French title, is Images on the Run. Cartier-Bresson suggested, much like Minor White in the essay that we read, that a photographer must always be receptive and ready to recognize the creative fraction of a second you have as a photographer to take a picture. In later interviews, he said he liked using the viewfinder on his small handheld cameras because he had one eye looking out and one eye looking in. Bresson's world was the public one before us in the street and the private one in the photographer's subconscious where the composition was formed. We have to pay attention, he argued, because once you miss the moment, it's gone forever. He wrote, "To me, photography is the simultaneous recognition in a fraction of a second of the significance of an event as well as a precise organization of forms which give that event its proper expression. In other words, a compelling street photograph is a perfect composition at the perfect moment." We talked about Robert Frank's The Americans in the last lecture and how important it was for modern and contemporary documentary practice because it was such a radical departure from traditional photojournalism. It was also a hugely important project for street photography for similar reasons. Just as it was in direct opposition to Steichen's Family of Man exhibition, it was also in direct opposition to the formalism advocated by Cartier-Bresson in The Decisive Moment. With The Decisive Moment, Cartier-Bresson argued that in order to have a truly compelling photograph, the spontaneity of the street or subject matter had to be captured in a compositionally precise moment, where all of the visual elements surrounding the subject matter had to align in just the right way. Frank, with his gritty, true-to-life, compositionally imperfect photographs, rejected all of that. And Robert Frank was largely rejected at the time by photography's mainstream, which was embodied by Edward Steichen and Henri Cartier-Bresson. But his work was hugely influential to subsequent generations of street photographers, particularly those working in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, like Gary Winogrand, Lee Friedlander, and Joel Meyerowitz, who represented a golden age of sorts for American street photography. Frank's work opened the door to more intimate individual work, where the anonymity of the street photographer was replaced by a more intimate relationship with the subject matter. John Sarkowski, MoMA's director of photography from 1962 to 1991, called Gary Winogrand a central photographer of his generation, and many critics have noted how in the late 60s and 70s he defined street photography as an attitude as well as a style. In the 1950s and 60s, he was a freelance photojournalist and advertising photographer, and he became preoccupied with New York City in the 60s. In 1964, he got a Guggenheim Fellowship to travel for photographic studies of American life. In 1969, he published The Animals, comprised of photos of the Bronx Zoo and Coney Island. He got another Guggenheim in 1969, this time to explore the effect of the media on events. Between 1969 and 1976, he photographed public events that culminated in a solo show at MoMA in 1977. He supported himself in the 70s by teaching, and that took him to LA in 1978. And in 1979, he got his third Guggenheim that allowed him to travel throughout the southern and western United States, documenting social issues of the day. In the 1960s and 70s, Leif Friedlander evolved an influential visual language of urban social landscape. Eugene Atget, Robert Frank, and Walker Evans heavily influenced his work. He was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1960 and again in 62 and 77. He worked primarily with Leica handheld 35mm cameras and black and white film, focusing on the social landscape where humans interact with the architecture of the city. His images reflect detached images of urban life, storefront reflections, structures framed by fences, posters, and signs, evidence of vibrant urban life. He got a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant in 1990, and in 2005, MoMA presented a major retrospective of his work. He is still working today. Joel Meyerowitz is an American street photographer and was an early pioneer and advocate of using color film at a time when color photography wasn't taken seriously as fine art. Meyerowitz worked as an art director at an ad agency, but after seeing Robert Frank at work, quit that job and started photographing the streets of New York with a 35mm camera and color film. In a later interview, he said, "In the pantheon of greats, there's Robert Frank and Atget." He began shooting exclusively with color in 1972 and switched to using a large format camera instead of the smaller 35mm. More recently, he was the only photographer allowed unrestricted access to Ground Zero following the September 11th attacks of 2001. He published a book, Aftermath: World Trade Center Archive, in 2006. In 2017, he was included in the Leica Hall of Fame. Just as Winogrand, Friedlander, and Meyerowitz were heavily influenced by Robert Frank and Eugene Atget, they influenced a whole new generation of contemporary street photographers, some of which, the way that Meyerowitz embraced color film, have embraced new forms of photography, social media, and particularly Instagram, to share their work real-time, giving us a glimpse of urban life as it's unfolding. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about how to do street photography. We'll look at some tips for finding your own decisive moment or rejecting it altogether, and we'll also talk about what legal rights you have as a photographer documenting public places.